Well, hello, my radio friends. Now, as promised, this is going to be a video on how I go about winding the coils on this. This is that speaker, the Pathé I'm doing presently. The coil was open, like I spoke earlier. I'm going to touch on how I go about winding them. Now, first and foremost, I use 42 gauge wire. And you're shooting for an ohmage range. It's not terribly critical, but in a realm of about 1,000 ohms. As I said, I use 42 gauge wire, but I like to use a little lead-in wire. In this case, I use 30 gauge wire. I soldered the 42 to the 30 gauge, and that stays recessed within the bobbin of the coil, and the coil gets wound on top of where that solder connection was. So that exiting the coil, one has a fairly large 30 gauge wire to contend with and soldered externally, and it makes for a more robust connection, so that's less likely to break the wire going into the coil. I use a wooden dowel. I have a bearing, a free bearing, real smooth bearing on both sides of the coil. And I have a piece of surgical tubing on each side of the bearing. And what that does, it works really swell, and it's very easy to do. One can merely just barely tweak the surgical tubing against that bearing, and you could adjust the amount of tension on this spool. And of course, with 42 gauge wire, you want very little tension. I put just enough to where it doesn't freewheel really readily. Just enough tension to put a little bit of tension on the coil. Once the 42 gauge wire with the lead-in is attached to the coil or the bobbin, I will run my Dremel tool, as one sees here, through the variac. You can't see it in the video, but maybe barely up top. I have a variac up here, and I bring the voltage down going into my Dremel tool to a very low voltage, so that what I could do is I hold the Dremel tool like so. I use my thumb as a speed control, and I put just a load against that chuck of the Dremel tool, and I can control the speed of the spool as it turns and of course receives the wire. My right hand, it's a multi-handed task. My right hand, I take the 42 gauge wire and gently and just kind of walk it back and forth across the bobbin. So I'm controlling the speed with my left hand and controlling the placement of the wire on the bobbin. I control the speed of my left hand, and I control the placement of the wire on the bobbin with my right hand. So it's a two-handed finesse kind of a thing. Takes a little bit of patience. One has to watch. It is somewhat easy to break 42 gauge wire, but once you get the hang of it and you kind of learn just what you can and can't get away with, it's not an awful task. In fact, this time around, I wound this complete bobbin the very first time, which honestly doesn't always happen. I got lucky this time. I had everything set up just so. Nothing elaborate. This is what Dave does. I'm sure there's probably some elaborate machinery and whiz-bang stuff to make it much easier, but this is what I have done for a lot of years. Real primitive, but it works well for me. Anyway, just thought I'd share what Dave does. Not saying it's the right way. It's just Dave's way. Thank you so much. Appreciate y'all following, and I will keep you abreast as things proceed. Thank you.